Today we're going to talk a little bit about Jewish beliefs. I don't use the word theology, not because Judaism doesn't have a theology, but when most Christians use the word theology, they think of something that people sometimes will call systematic theology. By that we mean sort of a set of propositions about God, which lead to certain conclusions, certain deductions, and so on and so forth, in a systematic or in a sort of logical kind of way. Jewish belief is not systematic, it is associative. So, well, I should say that the rabbinic Judaism is associative. There are attempts through Jewish history to create a systematic theology out of it. Maimonides is a good example. You may have heard of that name, famous Jewish medieval philosopher. But the attempts to create some kind of systematic theology out of Judaism exist mostly for the benefit of you guys. And what I mean is, well, not just for Christians, but for, well, see, Maimonides wrote a book called Guide for the Perplexed. And basically he wrote it for people who didn't know Judaism or who were distanced from it or had become dissociated from it in some way, and really didn't know even where to start in talking about what Jews believed. So he used Aristotelian philosophy, which was very popular in his day. I know it's hard to imagine philosophy being popular at any day, but in the medieval period, Aristotelian philosophy was popular. And what I mean by popular is that it was the cultured language of the, we would call them today sort of the cultural elite. Okay, the people who were the most educated, the most advanced socially, maybe also economically and so forth. So the people who set the tone for society. And we're talking now about medieval Spain, mostly. So he came up with a system of trying to explain Judaism in terms that they already knew, which was Aristotelian philosophy. And it kind of fits well in some places and doesn't fit so well in other places. But it's not anything remotely like what the classical rabbis were thinking. Okay, so it's a kind of translation process. Jewish philosophy tends to be a translation process for people who need something that they're familiar with in order to understand Judaism. Judaism as a belief system is based on textual interpretation. That's what it is. And if you were to study with me on a long-term basis, you would learn all sorts of stuff about paradox and the way rabbinic literature works and so on and so forth. But the one thing you would not learn is anything systematic, because Judaism doesn't work that way. It's not Greek, okay? It doesn't have that inheritance of the Greek syllogistic, logical order kind of system. It's much more existential, if you want to put it that way, although that's a little bit anachronistic as well. So when Jews talk about what they believe, they don't strive to have a set of beliefs that are all mutually consistent. In fact, if some of the beliefs contradict each other, that's fine. And I will tell you why that is. And as Christians, you ought to be aware of this. Anybody here be able to give me a definition of idolatry? What is idolatry?
Believing in other gods?
No.
No.
Worshiping something other than God, or making it the most.
Yes, but that doesn't quite fit the bill entirely. What you can believe in something other than God. You can believe in democracy. I believe in democracy, don't you? Yeah. But what's the difference between belief in democracy and belief in God? Why is believing in democracy possibly idolatry? Doesn't have to be. But believing in God is not.
Because democracy is not the all-powerful creator.
Yeah. So let's say I come up with a definition for what democracy is. All right, democracy is X, Y, and Z. Okay?
But also it would be, if you're worshiping democracy,
Yeah, but that's a fudge factor. What does it mean to say you're worshiping it?
it means you deify, it's the ultimate.
All fudge factors. You're not telling me anything else. You're just defining it in terms of what we already know. An idol is a false god. Okay, I understand. But what makes it false?
It ain't the genuine article.
And how do you know? What makes it not the genuine article?
Well, if we make it the most important thing in your life, like TV could be the most important thing in your life and therefore an idol.
But what makes it idolatry? How is it a false god?
It's your belief.
Hmm?
I think
See, we use these words all the time without knowing what they
You
mean.
can't say it unless
What's
you
your
already know
belief?
what the true God is.
Oh, yeah, I can, absolutely, 100%. With 100% conviction. Okay? I'll tell you why. It doesn't matter what religious system you're talking about. It applies to all religious systems. If you say that some representation of God, whether it's a definition, a picture, a person, whatever, that is exactly what God is, and there's nothing that God is that is not in that picture, that's an idol. That's the definition of an idol. God is always more than any definition or picture or representation we can come up with, by definition, because our minds are finite. We can't come up with any definition or picture or representation of God that isn't limited by our human minds. So it doesn't matter what religion we're talking about or which God it is. Anytime somebody says, here, this is God, and there's nothing that God is except what's in this representation, that's an idol. Okay, you following me? Mm-hmm. Is that a good definition of idolatry? Yes, it's an excellent one. So, here's the point. When we talk about God from the Jewish point of view, if we say, here is something that is absolutely true about God, and that it excludes something else, we're getting either very close or we've already passed the boundary of idolatry. You following me? Okay? That's why Maimonides, for example, has this notion of negative attributes. You can't say what God is, you can only say what God is not. I'm not sure it's better, but that's what Maimonides was trying to solve with that problem. Okay? So, is God loving? Yes. Is God vengeful?
Yes.
Yes. Come on.
Yes.
Is God kind?
Yes.
Yes. Is God petty?
Petty?
Petty.
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes. Seems like it, right? Okay? Does God always do something that makes sense to us?
No.
No. Are you still required to do it?
Yes.
Sometimes you are. I mean, my point is that God is paradoxical. Can't be anything but. Okay? If it were not paradoxical, God would be something that our human minds could encompass. And then who would be boss? Us or God? We would be. That's not exactly what you want to propose if you're proposing a belief in God. God is always, at least by definition, one step more complex than we are. Can't be any other way. You following me? So if that's the case, then the basic experience of God centers around, among other things, paradox. How is it God can be this when God is that? Isn't that the nature of the problems we have with believing in God? If God is this, how do you explain that? If God is good, then how come there is evil? And the answer is obvious. God is paradoxical. Okay? Now, the problem with this idea is that if your notion of God is that the God you want to have is something that doesn't challenge you, it makes you feel, nice and cuddly and warm without actually, challenging you in any way, this doesn't work. This only works if you're comfortable with what some people would call indeterminacy. Okay, I can deal with the fact that things are not exactly clear all the time. Sometimes they're very not clear. Okay? Sometimes the essence of life is that we have to embrace paradox. Okay? How many people here are parents? Okay? How many people here are children or were children? Okay, so here's what I want to ask. What I want to ask is, as a parent, to be a good parent, how much should you control your children?
Depends on their age.
But at any age, is total control
No.
good? No.
No.
At any age, is total license good? No, of course not.
No.
So we're constantly deciding how much control, how much freedom, how much we tell them what to do, how much choice do they have, right? And oddly enough, at certain points in our life and in theirs, the more we love them, the more we have to do what?
Let go.
Yeah. Now, I think that's a paradox. Don't you? I mean, the idea of paradox is embedded in the way life works. Is it strange to think that that centrality of paradox would somehow be absent from who or what God is? Isn't the world a reflection of God who created it? If that's the case, why would you expect there to be no paradox? Why would you expect things to be clear and logical and in line? And so experience is not like that. The universe is not like that. Okay? So, with that in mind, I want to start with a little clip from a movie that I love, and some of you probably have seen, which I think is one of the most theologically sophisticated movies ever done by Hollywood. It's called The Frisco Kid. And how many people have seen this movie? No? Oh, this is unusual. Well, it's Gene Wilder, who plays a Polish Orthodox rabbi who is sent by his yeshiva to go to San Francisco to be the rabbi of the congregation there, and he's bringing the Torah with him. And it's a picaresque movie. He has all sorts of adventures along the way, meeting America. And in the course of his travels, he meets up with a bank robber who is played by Harrison Ford. And the two of them become partners in going across the country. It's an absolutely wonderful movie. And during the course of this trip from the East Coast, Philadelphia, they disembarked, where the rabbi disembarks to go to San Francisco. He's already met up with Harrison Ford, and they are captured by a bunch of Indians. That's what they say there. Nowadays we would say Native Americans. Okay, so here we go. I love that clip because it is, when you think about it, when we define God, or we try to define God, what are we really doing? We're limiting God. We're saying that there are ways that God is prevented from acting. If God is absolutely powerful, God can do whatever God wants to do.
Yes.
And chooses to do one thing or another, which is, in a way, how human beings are. I just want to mention that it's all about choice. But be that as it may, if you say that God is prevented from doing X, then we're talking about limitations of God. God can be whatever God wants to be, is the point. That's what power means. Okay? So, we start out with this idea that God is not limited. God is not limited by nature. God is not limited by our conceptions about God. God is not limited by some preset set of definitions or some experience we've been handed down from prior generations. None of this limits what God is or can do, which is important to note for a number of reasons. Let me give you an example. Why would you think that it would be possible for the world to change unless it were possible for things to happen that had not happened before. You need to believe that it's possible for things to happen that have not happened before, that are new, that are different, that go against the way things have been. Right? So, why would you then think that God is not capable of doing that? In other words, if it's possible for us to think about a world which could be different because it's possible to change or to make other choices, then certainly at least, if we can do that, certainly God can. Is there something that we can do that God can't? Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? I mean, if you know, in the world of talking about God, I mean, if you don't believe in God, then none of this makes sense, but that's another story. So, hope is dependent upon the idea that God is unlimited. Okay? For example, let's say, for example, that something happens that is a personal disaster, and it's hard to make sense out of it. Death of a loved one, maybe a child, usually what people would say is the worst kind of thing that people go through. I'm not saying that you can sort of find some meaning in that makes it okay, but I'm wondering whether or not it's possible to learn something from an experience, even a terrible experience like that. Sure, it's possible to learn something. What makes it possible that you can learn something from a terrible experience? What are the requirements that you need to have in order to be able to learn something that's a horrible, negative experience? Anybody?
An open heart.
Trust.
I'm sorry, trust in what?
Just trust in God, trust in your belief, trust in your love.
Well, tell me what you mean, because, again, we use these terms in ways that often don't really have content. What does it mean?
Well, to me, it would be like leaning in, like knowing that there's a greater good, knowing that the message and the intention is bigger than the actual circumstance in itself.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can tell you as a clergy person who has to work with people from time to time who experience terrible losses,
Right.
that the worst thing I can say, if I'm coming into a house of mourning, is to say, well, you just haven't found what's good about this. You're not trusting enough. You just need to sort of wait and see what good comes out of this. That's a quick exit for the rabbi.
Right.
Okay.
Or someone that's had it happen.
Yeah.
Not that, but tragedy. I think that how I've survived situations like that was like my belief and my trust in the Lord and my knowing that maybe that's
You just have to know it inside. Somebody
that's what I mean.
can't
So
tell
someone
you.
can't tell me. So maybe I
Yeah,
answered
yeah.
the question correctly. I thought.
Well, I see your point. I'm not sure I agree with you because. Thank you. The reason I'm not sure I agree with you is that my experience tells me that when that gets tested, it doesn't stand up. Yeah, I'll tell you why. Because in the end, how do I put it? People being people, and I love people sometimes. It's always easier to have that kind of attitude when the problem is somebody else's. When it's your problem, it's much harder to hold on to that kind of belief. Have you had significant losses in your life?
Major.
Yeah, like what?
Major, children in utero, just a couple of times, actually 3. Father, tragically.
It works for
I've
you.
had some pretty intense
Okay, so it works for
crap
you.
happen,
All right.
but,
Makes sense.
and I feel like I'm stronger through it. I'm a lot stronger after it, especially from a faith perspective, way more so than I was prior. That's
Okay.
why, but maybe I'm just.
Well, I don't want to get into a whole deal here, but
Therapy free?
but
But your question, go back to what your question was. How does that change people? What happens in that kind of situation that would then change you?
well, what can you be changed positively? Can you learn something from a disaster, from a huge kind of loss? I think you can.
I don't feel like I've ever grown except out of pain or suffering. But that's when I do grow.
A lot of people would say the same thing. Not everybody has that experience. Some people grow from a variety of things, but pain is something that is like that. So what I'm asking is, what makes that possible? What makes it possible that we could grow or we could learn something through pain?
It cracks you open.
You're open. You're open.
You're open, right? That's one requirement,
It
absolutely.
forces you to depend on God.
Yeah, but how does that work? I mean, what does God do for you?